There are places in London that never stop breathing, even when you do. Streets that hum softly at dawn, carrying the warmth of 100 stories in their bricks. I used to walk through them half awake, thinking I understood the rhythm of solitude. I thought I knew what it meant to be content in my own company, to let the city fill the silence that I refused to name as loneliness. But then there was him. And now, every morning that passes feels like an echo of the moment everything changed quietly, without warning, like sunlight that finds its way through closed blinds. It began on an ordinary Thursday. I remember the sky being an uneven blue, clouds suspended like unfinished thoughts. I had stopped by the small café on the corner of Charing Cross Road, the one with the cracked tiles and the smell of roasted beans that lingered even on the pavement outside. I was late for work, as always, and the city was already pulsing with its usual indifference. He was there, though I didn't notice him at first. Or maybe I did, in that subtle way we sometimes register things that will later matter. I only recall the sense of something slightly altered, as if a familiar song had skipped a note and yet somehow sounded truer for it. I sat near the window, my hands wrapped around the cup, watching people hurry through the glass. London was rushing past, umbrellas clashing, car horns pleading. The steam from my coffee fogged the reflection, softening the world outside. It was in that blurred moment, I think, that I first sensed him watching me. There was no story then, no meaning, just the quiet awareness of being seen. It unsettled me, but not in a way that called for retreat. It was gentler than that, like realizing that someone has noticed your favorite book on the shelf before you mention it. Days passed. The cafe became a kind of ritual, a pause in the chaos. I began to time my mornings differently, not that I admitted why. He was always there, never beside me, never intruding, only existing in the same space. I remember the way he held his cup with both hands, as though it was a delicate thing he didn't want to harm. I remember the way he looked at people, not to judge but to understand. He had that rare stillness, the kind that absorbs the noise rather than adds to it. And slowly, without language, we began to recognize each other. A nod, a faint smile, the almost invisible choreography of two strangers who have become aware of their shared habit. The first time he smiled, it felt undeserved, too kind, too knowing. It lingered with me throughout the day, folding itself into my thoughts like a secret I wasn't sure I should keep. It's strange how love doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it grows beneath the surface of ordinary moments, unnoticed until it's already rooted. I didn't fall in love with him one day. I drifted into it, like fog creeping across the Thames at dawn, slow, certain, and impossible to resist. I began to see him everywhere, or maybe I began to see the city through the lens of what he made me feel. The lamplight on wet pavement, the rhythm of footsteps behind me, the faint scent of coffee on my scarf, everything became a reminder. I started walking home by different streets, wondering if I might meet him by accident. I began to notice small details, the way pigeons gathered near the fountains at Trafalgar Square, how the river looked different depending on my mood. The world seemed newly made, as if someone had quietly repainted it in colors I'd never noticed. Weeks turned into months. We still hadn't spoken. And yet, something between us had grown, a thread of recognition too delicate to name but too strong to ignore. Then came the day when I didn't see him. The cafe felt emptier, the light colder. The noise of the espresso machine was harsher than usual. I remember sitting there longer than I should have, watching the door open and close, pretending I was just waiting for my drink to cool. He didn't come the next day either, nor the one after that. I told myself it was foolish to notice. He was a stranger whose absence felt like the loss of something unfinished. When he returned a week later, something inside me shifted. He looked different, tired, maybe, or simply human in a way I hadn't allowed him to be before. He nodded at me, and in that brief exchange there was an understanding that words would only diminish. From then on, I began to measure time by his presence. My days acquired a strange symmetry, mornings framed by the quiet ritual of coffee and unspoken recognition, evenings haunted by the soft echo of it. I started to write again, nothing important, just fragments of thought, sketches of feeling. It was as though my inner world had awakened from a long hibernation. I noticed small changes in myself. The way I walked slower through the city, as if savoring the distance between one heartbeat and the next. The way I began to care about things again, the taste of coffee, the color of my coat, the sound of rain against the window. He hadn't done anything, not really. But somehow, through the gentleness of his presence, he had reminded me of what it meant to feel alive. There was a morning when our gazes met for longer than usual. It wasn't dramatic, but something quiet passed between us, a shared surrender, a recognition of what had been building in the silence. From that moment, it became impossible to return to pretending. The first time our hands brushed, a simple accident as we both reached for the same napkin, it felt like the city itself had paused. The sound of passing buses, the chatter, the hum, all of it receded into stillness. I remember the warmth of his skin, the electric realization that all those months of distance had led to this fragile, undeniable contact. After that, everything changed. Slowly, tenderly, and with the kind of inevitability that feels like destiny disguised as coincidence. We began to walk together, not planned, never arranged. Sometimes we left the cafe at the same time and headed in the same direction. London looked softer when we shared its streets. The gray skies didn't seem so heavy. I learned that he loved mornings, that he noticed details others ignored, the sound of pigeons' wings near the river, the faint shimmer of frost on railings. I never asked questions, and he never offered explanations. What bound us was not knowledge, but presence, that rare feeling of being deeply seen without having to speak. I remember one Sunday morning in particular. The city was quieter than usual, the air crisp and fragile. We walked along the embankment, and I could smell the faint salt of the river, the cold sharpness of winter near the water. He stopped to look at something, maybe nothing, and I found myself watching him instead. In that moment, I realized I was afraid. Not of him, but of how much I was beginning to need him. Love, when it first settles into you, is a kind of trembling. It fills you with light and fear in equal measure. I had built my life around self-sufficiency, around the safety of not depending on anyone. And here I was, undone by a man who had barely said a word to me. He became the quiet axis of my days. The city revolved around that 1 hour in the cafe, the smell of roasted beans, the warmth of porcelain against my hands, the steady awareness of him near me. Even when I didn't look, I could feel the outline of his presence. And then, gradually, we began to talk. Only small things: the weather, the crowded trains, the kind of coffee we preferred. But each word felt like a bridge across a silent sea. His voice surprised me. It was calm, steady, with a softness that seemed to carry its own silence within it. I began to look forward to it, not the words themselves, but the space they created, the gentleness of being understood without effort. He told me he was a photographer. I remember the way he described light not as brightness, but as weight, texture, emotion. I began to see the world differently after that. I noticed how the light in the cafe shifted between morning and afternoon, how faces looked different under rain. I began to think of light as something that could hold memory, that could shape feeling. He started bringing his camera sometimes, though he rarely used it. He said he preferred to look first, to understand what a moment meant before capturing it. I realized that's how he treated people too. It wasn't long before I found myself falling completely. Not in the loud, reckless way I once imagined love to be, but in a quiet surrender that felt both terrifying and sacred. He became the measure of my days, the one presence that made the ordinary shimmer. But with that tenderness came unease. There were moments when I sensed a distance in him, a quiet sorrow he never named. Sometimes, in the middle of a conversation, his gaze would drift, as if chasing a memory I wasn't part of. It frightened me, though I tried not to show it. Love, I was learning, isn't only about closeness. It's about the spaces between two people and how we learn to live inside them. The season changed. The light grew shorter, the air sharper. London in late autumn is a city of soft endings, leaves turning to gold, the sky folding into early darkness. It was in that dim beauty that I realized how deeply I had changed. I began to understand myself through him. The way I carried silence, the way I longed for connection and feared it at the same time. He didn't rescue me, he revealed me to myself. And that was, perhaps, the most dangerous kind of love, the kind that leaves you unable to return to who you were before. Sometimes, when I think back to those months, I wonder if it was all leading to something inevitable, a moment of truth, or loss, or both. There was a tension beneath the calm, a sense that something fragile was trembling under the surface. And yet, for a while, it was enough simply to be. To share coffee and quiet mornings, to walk through the city with the steady rhythm of two hearts learning to exist near each other. I remember the smell of roasted beans, the faint chill of November air, the warmth of his presence beside me. That was how love began for me, not with grand gestures, not with words, but with the smallest moments that accumulated like breath. It was in the way he looked at the light, in the way his presence made me notice the world again. It was in the gentle, terrifying realization that I had let someone in, quietly and completely. And though I didn't know it then, that love, as unexpected as it was, would change everything that followed. There are memories that linger like scents, faint but persistent, refusing to fade no matter how many seasons pass. When I think of him now, I think first of mornings, the smell of roasted coffee drifting into the chill air, the pale London light spilling across the table, and that quiet sense of recognition that never needed to be spoken. The winter that followed was both sharp and tender. The city wrapped itself in gray, and the Thames carried its low, endless hum through the days. Everything felt muted, the colors, the sounds, even time itself, and yet within that stillness, something between us deepened. It wasn't passion in the loud, cinematic sense. It was quieter than that, steadier, like the glow. It was quieter than that, steadier, like the glow of a lamp in a fogged window. He began to walk me to the station sometimes. We didn't talk much. There was comfort in the silence, in the sound of footsteps echoing against the damp pavement. Occasionally, he would glance up at the sky, as if measuring how much light the morning would give us. I often wondered what he was thinking, but I never asked. Some part of me was afraid that to name it would somehow disturb the fragile magic that held us. It's strange, the intimacy that grows in the small moments, the way a hand brushing against yours can say more than any confession. I remember the first time he took my hand intentionally. We were crossing the street near Covent Garden. A gust of wind had lifted my scarf, and without hesitation, he reached for me. His fingers were cold, and yet the warmth of that gesture stayed with me long after. That was the first time I realized how much he had become part of the way I moved through the world. The days that followed were made of these quiet, luminous fragments. Coffee and light, walks by the river, the murmur of the city fading behind us. I started noticing things through his eyes, the way puddles caught reflections, how winter sunlight slid between buildings, how even the most ordinary corners of London carried their own kind of poetry. He told me once that he loved photographing people when they didn't know they were being seen. That's when truth happens, he said. I thought about that often, how love, too, reveals truth when we stop performing it. Around him, I didn't feel the need to be anyone other than myself. That was a kind of freedom I hadn't known I needed. As the days shortened, I began to spend more evenings at his small flat in Bloomsbury. It was modest and slightly untidy, filled with books, cameras, and the smell of coffee grounds that never quite left the air. There were photographs pinned to the walls, fragments of other lives, other places, but none of us. He said he didn't want to capture what was still unfolding. Some things, he told me once, are meant to live only in memory. We fell into a rhythm that felt both ordinary and miraculous. Breakfasts in half-light, long walks with no destination, shared silences that felt like entire conversations. Sometimes I would wake before him and watch the faint rise and fall of his breath, the way the morning light traced the lines of his face. It struck me then how strange it was to find peace in someone else's existence, to feel at home not in a place, but in a presence. And yet love, even the gentlest kind, carries its shadows. There were moments when he withdrew into himself, when a quiet melancholy passed over him like a cloud. I never knew its source, and he never explained. It was part of him, like the lines around his eyes, or the way he stirred his coffee absent-mindedly before drinking it. I learned not to chase it away. Love, I was beginning to understand, isn't about fixing what's broken. It's about learning to live tenderly beside it. One evening, as we walked through St. James's Park, snow began to fall light and hesitant, barely touching the ground before disappearing. The city seemed to hold its breath. He stopped, tilting his head upward, watching the flakes dissolve against the air. Something in his stillness made my heart ache. I reached for his hand, and he squeezed it once, as if to say, "I'm here." I didn't need more than that. It was around then that I began to write again, properly this time, with intention. Words had always been my way of making sense of the world, but somewhere along the years I had stopped believing in their worth. He changed that. His quietness gave me permission to listen to myself, to the city, to the subtle music of ordinary life. I began writing about small things, the sound of spoons clinking in cafes, the warmth of lamplight on cold evenings, the softness of his laughter when he thought I wasn't listening. He never asked to read what I wrote, but I think he knew he was in every line. Spring came late that year. When it did, London transformed, suddenly full of light and blossoms and people smiling as if they'd just remembered how. The cafe where we'd first seen each other placed small vases of tulips on the tables. I remember sitting there one morning, watching the reflection of sunlight ripple across the window, and realizing how far I had come from the woman who once sat alone, hiding behind her coffee cup. He joined me a little later, his hair damp from the rain, and when he smiled, something in me steadied. We had never used the word love. We didn't need to. It was there, quiet but undeniable, in the way our lives had intertwined. That summer, we took a trip to the coast, nothing grand, just a few days away from the city. I can still see it clearly, the vastness of the sea, the sound of waves colliding with the wind, the faint taste of salt on my lips. We walked barefoot along the shore, collecting fragments of shells. He carried his camera but never lifted it. When I asked why, he said, "Because I want to remember it as it feels, not as it looks." That was him, always reaching for the essence of things, not their surface. I think that's what I loved most about him. There was a moment, just before sunset, when he turned to look at me, and for an instant, the world seemed to hold its breath again. The light wrapped around us, soft and golden, and I thought, this is it. This is what it means to be seen. It wasn't about beauty or perfection. It was about being present, completely and without fear. When we returned to London, something in me had settled. I no longer feared the quiet or the uncertainty. Love had made me softer, not weaker. It had taught me that vulnerability was not a fracture but a doorway. Through him, I learned to inhabit my own life fully, not as an observer, but as a participant. Autumn came again, and with it, a shift. He received an offer to work abroad for a few months, a photography project in northern Italy. I remember the way he told me, hesitant but hopeful, as though waiting for my reaction. I felt the familiar tremor of fear, the instinct to protect myself from loss, but I pushed it aside. Love, I realized, was not about holding on too tightly. It was about giving each other the space to become who we were meant to be. So I told him to go. The weeks without him were strange, the city both familiar and altered, as if the rhythm of it had changed key. I still went to the cafe every morning, sitting by the same window, watching the same river of people. But instead of emptiness, I felt something else, a quiet gratitude. He had left traces everywhere, in the way I noticed the light, in the way I listened to the city's breathing. We wrote to each other often letters, not messages. His handwriting was uneven, hurried, full of life. He described the colors of the Italian sky, the sound of church bells at noon, the people he photographed. I told him about London, about the rain and the tulips, about how the cafe had changed its chairs again. It was strange how distance could make affection sharper, clearer. When he returned in late winter, I met him at St. Pancras. The station was crowded, filled with the noise of trains and reunions, but when I saw him, everything else fell away. There was no dramatic rush, no tears, just a simple embrace that felt like coming home. Life after that was not perfect, but it was real. We moved into a small flat near Primrose Hill, filled it with plants that never quite survived and books we never finished reading. We argued sometimes about dishes, about deadlines, about nothing at all. But even in those moments, I felt the same underlying warmth, the same sense of being anchored by something larger than either of us. He still took photographs, I still wrote. Sometimes our work overlapped, his images finding their way into my words, my stories echoing his light. We never planned it that way, it just happened. Two lives intertwining, quietly shaping each other. Years have passed since that first morning in the cafe. Sometimes I walk past it still. It looks different now, new chairs, brighter walls, a younger crowd. But every time I pass by, the smell of coffee drifts out onto the pavement, and I feel that same flicker of recognition, that same warmth of the day everything began. I often think about how love changes us not through grand moments, but through the accumulation of small ones. A smile across a crowded room, the brush of a hand, the steady rhythm of two people choosing again and again to be kind. He still reaches for my hand when we cross the street. I still wake before him sometimes, watching the morning light trace the lines of his face. And every day, I am reminded that love, at its truest, is not a burning. It's a steady glow. It doesn't demand, it illuminates. There is peace in that. When I look back now, I see the story of us not as a beginning and an end, but as a continuum, a thread that has woven itself quietly into the fabric of my life. The woman I was before him feels distant, like a photograph taken in poor light. The woman I became after, she sees the world differently. She lingers in moments. She listens. She notices the scent of coffee and the way morning light moves across a window pane. Love didn't save me. It reminded me that I was already whole, and that sharing that wholeness with another soul is the most human thing we can do. Sometimes, when he's asleep beside me and the city hums softly outside, I close my eyes and return to that first morning. The fogged glass, the hum of London beyond it, the quiet recognition in his gaze. And I think that's where the light began. And the most beautiful part is it never really left.